Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Johnson, and I work in the security GRC function at Anthropic. I spend most of my time on the control side of the house, bridging the gap between our engineers and our auditors, focusing on SOC 2, CSA Star, SOX, HIPAA, basically all of our compliance requirements, and again, bridging those gaps between our engineers and the auditors. About a year ago, my engineering team came to me and said, hey, we want to be able to allow AI to approve, author, and deploy code changes to production without a human in the loop. And I didn't have an answer for them. I didn't know if the frameworks allowed for it. I wanted us to be able to increase velocity, but I wasn't sure exactly what to say. So what did I do? Like most compliant people would do is I went and looked at the frameworks and said, what do they say about this? And that's what this talks about. What did the frameworks say about it? What we've done about it at Anthropic, and then maybe some practical ways that you guys can take this back to your own organizations. So like I mentioned, we'll go through sort of three areas. The gap from a frameworks, like what they actually say today, focusing on CCM, CAIQ, CSA Star, SOX, and SOC 2. Part two, we'll talk about at Anthropic, what we've built, sort of four principles that we're running in production today in terms of how we've handled this. And then again, lastly, sort of trying to boil this down into a pattern that you can take to your own program in terms of CCM or AICM terms. All right, so let's start with sort of the gap and what the frameworks actually say. So when I went and did my research, I was a bit surprised. Every major change control framework assumes humans review and approve every production change. And I think that's probably the assumption for most of us. That was my assumption. But when you actually get into the wording, none of them actually say a natural person or a human. If you go read the control text, the assumption that I had was not actually the requirements. The vocabulary reads authorized individual, they say personnel, they say segregation of duties. And certainly our audit evidence is built upon the fact of having a human in the loop, but we don't necessarily have anything that says a human has to do the approver. It doesn't say the approver must be a natural person. It's not there. It's not in CCM, it's not in SOC 2, and it's not in ITGC guidance for SOX. Human reviewer is largely the assumption that nobody wrote down. And that means when an AI system starts doing the approver, the frameworks are not the ones that are going to be telling us if we're compliant or not, right? They're silent on it. And so that gap is really what we're focusing on here, and the challenge and hopefully the solution that we enabled at Anthropic. Why this matters now, it's not a hypothetical. Like I mentioned, our engineering team came to me about a year ago and said, hey, how do we do this in a compliant way? And so at Anthropic, as you could imagine, our systems, our AI models are doing the review, the approval of production code changes today at scale. And I sort of, to give you a sense of how fast this is been moving, the beginning of 2025, most of our code was still either authored by a human or some combination of a model and a human. By the end of last year, most of our code, 70, 80, 90% of our code is being written by a human, or excuse me, by an AI model. And that velocity is not going to be able to be kept up with a human review in the loop. And so hence the engineering team's coming and saying, how do we allow a AI model to approve the changes, release them to production, since we have so much code being written by the model itself? And I don't think we're unique here. Based upon the adoption of our models, how much Claude or other models are writing code, I assume that if your engineering org isn't already asking you about it today, in the next year or so, they'll be asking you about how do we allow AI models, how do we allow AI to approve changes in a compliant fashion? So the question on the slide here is kind of what I want you to think about, which is if we assume that a human reviewer is not required, what does the compliance framework actually look like? I think frameworks are going to need to catch up, but until they do, I think we need to be able to provide engineering teams with practical solutions, with real solutions that allow us to address the velocity that each of our engineering teams are hoping to drive today. So being more specific here, if we start with CCMV4 and what the frameworks say, which I think most of us are probably mapped against, there's the 9 CCC categories that we have: our domains, policy, quality testing, the technical control, unauthorized change to production, change agreements, baseline, deviation detection, exception management, change restoration. You know the list. But if we look at some of those individual controls, CCCO2, the language, and I'll quote it, is a defined quality change control and approval and testing process. And that's the CSA's own guidance around it. The quote is, the appropriate change management authority authorizes changes. So we're talking about process, we're talking about authority, we're talking about approval, but it's completely abstract of who the authority is. There's no control in the CCC domain that defines authority as a person. And the detail that I found interesting in CCM version 3.01 actually did have language about the business leader or other accountable business role in the change control context. But when it was restructured for version 4, that language came out. So CCM did not get more explicit about human approvers as AI arrived. It got less explicit. I don't know that that was intentional, but it means that an AI approving a change arguably satisfies CCCO2 exactly as it's written today. If you look at CAIQ and CSA star, the gap isn't just for CCM, it propagates through the rest of these frameworks. So the CAIQ version 4, right, 261 questions, each one mapped to the CCM control. The change control reads like, is a defined quality change control approval and testing process followed? It's binary. It's a yes or no question. There's no question anywhere in the CAIQ that says, is this a human approver? CSA star is built on top of that, right? Level 1 is the CAIQ itself. Level 2 adds independent audit, right? So whether it's SOC 2 or ISO. Again, none of these specifically say human reviewer, which means technically a star attested provider could today have an AI approve every single change they ship, and there's nothing in the questionnaire or the attestation that would require them to actually disclose it. And this is not a criticism, it's just the facts of the way the frameworks are written today. A little bit of irony here is, and offered with affection, in 2025, CSA launched an AI tool that validates the CAIQ submissions. So the CSA is using AI inside its own assurance chain, while the CCM itself is still silent on AI approvers. But I actually think that this shows that the CSA is ahead of the curve on using the technology. We just haven't caught up in the language, and I think that's a common thing with a lot of our frameworks. Looking at SOX, and I think this is what keeps me up the most at night as Anthropic prepares for public readiness. I think this is where SOX has the strongest assumption that a human is in the loop. So if you have a financial reporting system in scope, I would assume this one would keep you up at night. Section 404 requires management to assess internal controls over financial reporting, right? Change management is one of the core IT general controls. The PCAOB standards that govern how our external auditors look at this, they look at it in terms of IT personnel gaining inappropriate access. So they look at personnel, they're looking at segregation of duties. But again, it's, I guess, SOD is universally defined in practice as requiring more than one person to complete the control. And then on top of that, sections 302 and 906 put personnel certification liability on named executives, right? So your CFO, your CEO sign their names to it, right? So there's a lot more concern here around the change control process. But again, the same sort of open question is there today, which is, if the same AI system writes a change and then approves that change, does segregation of duties hold? There's no PCAOB guidance on this, right? I've looked. There's no staff interpretation. There's not a practice alert. So, I don't have a definitive answer on this, and I don't think anybody does. But I'll show you from a risk management, from a compliance perspective, how we have structured our controls to be able to address some of the ambiguity when it comes to SOX scope systems. Talking about SOC 2 then, keep going through these frameworks. This is the most interesting to me in terms of where there's a gap between what is written and what is happening in practice. On the left side here, we see that Common Control 8.1, as written, says the entity authorizes, designs, develops, acquires, configures, tests, approves, and implements changes. Reading that carefully, the subject of the sentence is the entity. The entity approves. It's completely neutral about who inside the entity is doing the approving. And then on the right-hand side, I think is probably what happens in our audits every single year, right? The assessor expects to see an authorized individual or group. They expect to see that that person who developed the change can't unilaterally approve it. They expect to see evidence that there's a pull request with a named human reviewer on it. So the written criteria does not exactly require a human, but auditor practice here absolutely does. And again, there's no guidance from the AICPA yet on whether an AI reviewer satisfies the CCA.1 or how segregation of duties works when both the author and the approver are models. So the space between the letter of the criterion and the practice of the auditor is exactly where I think AI approved changes are landing right now. So putting all of those frameworks that we went through sort of side by side on one page, we look at the 5 of them and the relevant control, the actual approval language, and whether it requires a human. Again, CCM says change control authority, doesn't require a human. The CAIQ inherits CCM, so again, the same answer. CSA star inherits its framework based on the inherits its requires based upon those other frameworks. So again, the answer is no. SOX ITGC says personnel, so that's probably and leans super hard on segregation of duties. So human requirement is more or less implicit here, which probably is the strongest framework supporting human in the loop. And then SOC 2 CCA.1 says the entity approved, right? So I don't think for the criterion requires it, but in practice, our auditors are generally requiring it. So I think we have a consistent pattern here, right? The written controls are neutral, but the audit practice assumes a human, and we don't have anything that really bridges the gap today. So I do want to make sure that we give the CSA credit for genuine progress, right? So July 2025, the AI control matrix came out. Version 1.1 has 200 and some odd controls across 18 domains. It's built on CCM, and it adds a dedicated model development security domain, and it ships with its own CAIQ questionnaire and its own star tier. And AICM is the first framework in the entire stack to make human oversight of AI explicit. It does that through mapping to the EU AI Act, specifically Article 14, which says high-risk AI systems must be, and I quote, effectively overseen by natural persons. Again, natural persons, that being the first place that it really shows up in normative text in any of the frameworks that we've looked at today. But I think sort of to the open question that I have, and hopefully everybody would have, is AICM governs AI as the system being secured, the thing we're protecting. Does change control domain itself, which inherits from CCM, also address AI acting as the approver? AI as the actual thing executing a control rather than the thing being controlled? My reading is I don't know that it does yet, but again, either way, giving credit to CSA here, the AICM I think is the right place to close this gap, and I think it's going to. All right, so I've talked a bunch about the standards and what I found, and I think where the gaps and the ambiguity is, and now I want to talk a bit about what we're doing about it at Anthropic, and sort of what's the Frontier Lab doing to close the gap between what's written and what we're doing in practice and maintaining compliance. So there's effectively 4 principles that I want to go through. The first one is really the foundation for everything else. And then we'll go through the remaining principles. So the idea here is we can't treat all changes the same. Every change that comes through our systems gets classified at the file level by an AI agent into one of 5 tiers. Tier 1's at the top. That's anything in financial reporting scope, anything that touches model weights, anything handling sensitive personal data, security critical code paths, and probably maybe most importantly, the chain of trust for the AI reviewer itself. If the AI can change the code that decides what the AI is allowed to approve, then obviously we have a problem. So that's also tier 1. Tier 2 is the attestation scope. So SOC 2 relevant systems, moderately sensitive data. And then we have tier 3 through 5. And those come down from their internal tooling, experimental code, documentation. Principle 2 is the strongest claim that I guess I will make today, and I'm confident about this. Regulated paths never leave the human review ever. With the ambiguity we see in SOX, with the idea that we can't bridge this gap yet, we have to be able to maintain some level of confidence, a high degree of confidence, that where we need human review, we have it. Here's how it's layered. First, we have a list of file paths. So these are hard-coded paths that always require human review. So think about things that touch financial reporting pipeline, things that are addressing security, authorization lists. These things are put on a hard list. The idea here is can only add things to the list. We have to go through its own change control process outside of AI to be able to remove them. You can put something on it, but you can't take it off. Second, the check looks at the current file name and any previous file name on the change, right? So the idea here is you wouldn't want to be able to rename a SOC scope file and then like name it, it's billing X, and then you name it something that is more inconspicuous, and that slid past the gate. And then third, any tier 1 verdict that the classifier has is forcing human review, full stop. It doesn't matter what else is configured. So everything else we talk about, AI approval is only possible through tiers 3 through 5. And then fourth, required reviewer scopes are never waived. If the security team has to review changes to the authorization policy, that is always going to hold true whether a human or an AI is doing the rest of the review. The ownership of the configuration itself, again, always requires human review. The AI cannot review the rules about what the AI is allowed to do. And then lastly, before any code area can turn on AI approval at all, there's a documented compliance review where someone attests that they have checked the SOC scope, financial reporting pipelines, and the authentication scope to make sure that none of those fall within tier 1. That attestation is enforced by an automated test, and if it's not there, then the configuration change fails and AI approval will not be allowed. Moving to principle 3, we talked about the tiering. We talked about the preventative controls in place to ensure the tiering works. Principle 3 is really about the detective controls. So where we do allow AI to do approval, we want to have specific gates in place. So the mental model here is, again, moving from preventative control on every change, a human looks at everything before it's shipped, to detector controls behind the AI. The AI makes the decision. We have solid ways to check that it's deciding in the best way that it can or in line with what a human would decide. So there's 4 pieces to that. First is shadow mode evaluation, right? So the AI decisions before it's subject to AI approval runs and is logged for every change with a flag that says what decision the AI would have made, but it's not enforcing it, right? So AI is just being logged in a shadow mode to determine what it would have done. So we're capturing what the AI would have decided. This allows us to be able to say, hey, what would a human have done versus the AI done before we flip the switch? How many things would have been blocked? Were those the right ones to block? Do we have false positives? Do we have false negatives? That's what's operating today. Second, for every AI decision, we also capture the human reviewers, what they actually did on the same change, right? So did they just approve it? Is it just an LGTM check? Did they request the changes to it? Did they do nothing? And again, this allows us to give that human baseline against the AI baseline and compare the two prior to anything going live. And then third, there's a feedback channel that we have where engineers can report what, based upon the shadow mode and what the human has done, what the AI got wrong. We feed those into a database, and then that allows us to do regression testings over what the reviewers have done. Fourth, and to be specific here, we want to make sure that the program is designed with risk-weighted human sampling. So it's not just as much to be able to have a log of what the AI would have done, a log of what the humans would have said the AI should do, but we also need to be able to do periodic sampling over that from a human perspective to make sure we understand for those that are actually being approved, would a human have made those same decisions? So we're preventing it from happening, and where it's implemented, we're reviewing it on a periodic basis to make sure that we don't have drift from what we had planned to have AI do originally. All right, the fourth principle. And I think this is what our auditors, they've asked us, and what your auditors would ask you is, well, show me who approved the change and prove that that change record wasn't tampered with. And our answer here is that every change request is recorded into a change database. That record includes the named human behind every approval and every override. So that database is serving as our audit record for all changes. And that's what we show our assessor. We also stream any change events to our data warehouse for analytics and reporting purposes. But again, the primary database is the system of record for our auditors. Every override of a required check is typed, meaning we capture what kind of override it was and is attributed to a named person. Break glass events and force merges are retained in line with our audit requirements, and then we review those via a quarterly attestation. Lastly, the AI reviewer writes its decisions to a separate storage, and those decisions then are written to the central database. The AI itself is not allowed access to that central database. So that in that way, we again are reinforcing this idea that an AI can't change its own files, it can't change its own configuration, and it can't modify its own audit trail. So we're implementing segregation of duties the best way that we can, and for answering that with a straight face, sort of like how are you preventing the AI from tampering with the audit logs? We have a mechanism of doing that. All right, so then in terms of like how we did this, it wasn't just creating these systems because it was the best that we could come up to. We wanted to make sure that in parallel, we also made sure that they map to our compliance frameworks, right? So everything that I just described maps onto a CCM control that we already report against. CCCO2 asks for a defined approval process. That's the tier classifier that I discussed, the ownership configuration in that process. It's defined, it's documented, it's tested. CCCO4 is unauthorized change production. This is that hard path list that I said, the sort of the additive only, as well as the tier 1 veto. CCCO7 is the detection of deviation from baseline. So that's the shadow mode logging and the comparison against human decisions. And then we've got CCCO8, exception management, right? So that's the typed overrides attributed to human names, the break glass retention, and the quarterly attestation. And the human overrides expectation that I talked about that AICM brings, that maps to the fact that the regulated tiers stay under mandatory human review, and detective controls provide the oversight of the AI on the delegated tiers. So again, we're maintaining compliance with AICM inherently by the mandatory human reviews, the detective controls, and the delegated tiers. For us at Anthropic, we have SOC 2 Type 2, CSA star attestations today, and this is the model that we have built to satisfy that criteria. So part 3, how can you take this back to your own program? Here's the pattern. And I want to emphasize that none of this is specific to our tooling. You can do this whatever change management stack you have. So step one, is classify every change so you know what is touching your regulated scope. You can't gate what you can't see, and there's just, like I mentioned, there's too much ambiguity to date to be able to determine, like, can we allow this for SOX? Is your auditor going to allow this? So prevent it up front, and then you can relax it after the fact. Step 2, keep the regulated scope under human review, and make sure that the mechanisms that enforce that are governed themselves. So again, the idea that I went through, that you need to prevent the AI model from regulating itself. You can't have it make its own modifications. Step 3 is hopefully delegate the rest to AI. Capture that velocity, right? Put the detective controls behind it. Put the shadow evaluations in place so you can see what you do before you actually let it do it. Do the comparison against what human outcomes would have been so that we have a baseline. Once it's implemented, do the sampling, create a feedback loop. And then step 4, like I talked about, keep the audit trail, right? Keep an immutable audit trail, prevent the AI systems to being able to edit it, allow it to write to it. Keep a track of every human override. You're going to need that for your auditors. But I think those are the 4 steps that you could put into place that map to the CCM. They map to SOC 2, they map to AICM. And then when your assessor shows up, we have engineering principles that have applied in practice. These principles have been mapped to the specific controls. They're evidenced and auditable. All right, so I kind of want to close with some open questions that maybe they're not for this audience specifically, but the way that I think about it for the standards bodies, because I think we have real questions that as practitioners that we can't answer on our own. So the first is, if the same AI writes a change and approves it, does segregation of duties hold? The PCAOB doesn't say, the AICPA doesn't say. What's the answer here? Second, should CCM and AICM define what approval authority is explicitly, right? So should it either include AI systems or exclude them? Right now, I think the silence just leaves everybody guessing. Third, should the CAIQ simply ask whether the reviewer is a human? That it's one question that could probably close the gap in terms of the ambiguity. Fourth, what evidence should a CSA star level 2 assessor expect when the approver is a model, right? There's no guidance on what that evidence should be. We're not sure yet. We hope to answer that, but what is the answer? We really need the standards bodies to be able to set these or answer these questions. I should note there is work happening on agent identity standards, right? So the AIUC standard is part of the STAR registry, which is super promising. But again, it does not address change control or change approval directly yet. And I don't think that we should wait for answers to these questions, right? I think we should build our own controls now. What I've laid out is some of the ways that at Anthropic we're dealing with the ambiguity between what the standards say and what is being done in practice. But if you're involved with CSA working groups, super happy to talk to you about it. I appreciate the time.